$490 billion, built in complete silence, destroyed in a single day. Let that land for a moment. The most expensive structure ever constructed in human history wasn't built in the 20th century. It wasn't engineered by a superpower with satellites and steel. It didn't have laser levels, hydraulic cranes, or project management software. It was built 3,000 years ago by a king who inherited a dream he didn't start. Using a workforce of 183,000 people, materials worth nearly $500 billion, and a construction method so eerily precise that engineers today still can't fully explain how it was executed without a single tool. Striking stone on site, a building so saturated in gold that merchants approaching Jerusalem at midday had to shade their eyes from a full mile away. Not decorated with gold, not accented with gold, covered every wall, every floor, every ceiling, gold, and yet the man who built it nearly bankrupted his kingdom doing it. The labor he used planted resentment so deep it outlasted his own reign. And 373 years after the most expensive building in human history was completed, after the day God himself showed up and filled the room so completely that trained priests fell face down on the floor and couldn't stand, Babylon marched in and burned it to ash in a single afternoon. This is the story of Solomon's temple, and I promise you, what they taught you in Sunday school was only the beginning. To understand the scale of what Solomon attempted, you first have to understand the man who made it possible and why that man was never allowed to build it himself. King David is one of the most complex figures in all of ancient history: poet, warrior, political genius, the man who took a fragmented collection of 12 tribal territories and forged them, through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, into a unified empire. He killed Goliath as a teenager. He outmaneuvered King Saul for years while hunted through the wilderness. He conquered Jerusalem, a fortified hilltop city the previous inhabitants called impregnable, and made it his capital. By the time David sat securely on the throne, Israel controlled trade routes from Egypt to the Euphrates. Tribute flowed in from a dozen conquered kingdoms. The national treasury was overflowing. And David had one dream that consumed the final chapter of his life. God needed a house for 400 years. The divine presence among the Israelites had dwelled in the tabernacle, an elaborate tent structure, portable by design, built for a people who were always moving. But Israel wasn't moving anymore. David had given them a home, a capital, an empire. It felt wrong, he told his court, that he lived in a palace of cedar, while God lived in a tent. So David announced his intention to build the greatest temple the world had ever seen. God's response, recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7, is one of the most unexpected passages in the entire Bible. He said no, not to the temple, to David specifically. The reason wasn't corruption. It wasn't a lack of faith. It wasn't political. God gave David a single explanation, and it changed everything about how the temple would be built. You are a man of war, and you have shed blood. The house of peace had to be built by a man of peace. Don't think about what that meant for David personally. He had spent his entire life building toward this moment. The wealth, the empire, the political stability, all of it was supposed to culminate in this one act of devotion. And now he was being told he would never see it happen. A lesser man would have abandoned the project entirely. A bitter man might have spent his remaining years in resentment. David did something different. He decided to make sure his son couldn't fail. Picture David in his final years, not on a battlefield, not on a throne, but in a treasury room. The hands that killed Goliath now grip a counting stylus. The eyes that once tracked enemy formations now trace inventory columns. Talent by talent, shekel by shekel, everything accounted for with the same meticulous precision he once applied to military campaigns. Because David understood something most leaders never grasp. Vision without resources is just a wish. 1 Chronicles chapter 22 pulls back the curtain on what he actually assembled. From the national treasury, funded through decades of war spoils, tribute from conquered kingdoms, and profits from Israel's expanding trade network, David designated 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver for the temple project. But he didn't stop there. From his own personal fortune, he added 3,000 more talents of gold. Specifically, Ophir gold, the premium grade, sourced from somewhere on the Arabian coast or East Africa, the ancient world's equivalent of conflict-free certified pure, and 7,000 talents of the finest refined silver, bronze and iron. The text says there was so much the scribes stopped trying to weigh it. Entire storerooms were filled with gemstones, onyx, turquoise, marble, and stones with names that don't translate cleanly into modern languages because we've simply lost track. Now let's translate those ancient numbers into something that actually registers. 1 talent equaled approximately 34 kilograms, about 75 pounds. Run that calculation across the gold reserves alone, and you arrive at 3,400 metric tons of gold at today's gold price, around $4,500 per troy ounce. That's $490 billion. Just the gold. The silver adds another $80 billion. Total raw materials before a single worker was paid, before a single contract was signed, before a single stone was cut, approximately $590 billion. The International Space Station, the most expensive engineering project in human history, cost $150 billion total. Solomon's temple had nearly 4 times that budget in raw materials alone. But here's the part David understood that made him a truly great father. He also called the craftsmen. He organized the priests. He drew up architectural plans. 1 Chronicles 28 records him handing Solomon a detailed blueprint, floor dimensions, room specifications, the design of the furnishings. Every detail David had apparently spent years working out, all of it transferred to his son. Be strong and courageous, he told Solomon at that handover. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the temple of the Lord is finished. Then David died, and Solomon, a young king, probably no older than his mid, stared at a blueprint, a treasury, and a promise, and had to figure out how to build the most complex structure the ancient world had ever seen. Solomon inherited the wealth. What he didn't have was the raw materials, the expertise, or the trees. Israel in 950 BC was fundamentally an agricultural nation. Its people were extraordinary farmers, skilled shepherds, talented Their military had proven itself. Their administration was sophisticated, but construction at monumental scale. That was a different craft entirely, and the specific material Solomon needed most simply didn't exist anywhere within his borders. Cedar of Lebanon was the premium structural timber of the ancient world. Unlike the scrubby pines and acacias native to Canaan, Lebanese cedar grew massive. Some trees exceeded 100 feet in height, with trunks so wide that 2 grown men extending their arms couldn't touch fingers around them. The wood was extraordinarily naturally aromatic, and possessed a fine, even grain that made it ideal for both structural beams and decorative work. It was, essentially, the structural steel of the ancient world. And it grew only in one place, the high mountain forests of Phoenicia, in the territory of modern-day Lebanon, owned and controlled by King Hiram of Tyre. Tyre was the ancient world's maritime superpower, and Hiram was at the height of his power when Solomon sent his diplomatic delegation northward. Phoenician ships dominated Mediterranean trade. They were the first people to reliably navigate by the North Star, which extended their sailing season from daylight hours into night and allowed them to range far beyond where other ancient sailors dared to go. Their traders had already established colonies in Cyprus, Sardinia, and North Africa. Their craftsmen were so technically accomplished that neighboring kingdoms, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel, paid extraordinary premiums to hire them. Hiram had already supplied cedar to David years earlier. He knew the family, he knew the kingdom, and he was a businessman. Solomon's letter, preserved in 1 Kings chapter 5, was direct. My father wanted to build this. War prevented him. God has given me peace. I'm building now. I need timber and craftsmen. Hiram responded enthusiastically. But let's be clear about what this arrangement actually was. This wasn't friendship. This wasn't religious solidarity. This was a 20-year commercial contract, and the terms were significant. Every year for 2 decades, Israel would deliver 4,400 tons of wheat, the dietary staple of Hiram's urban, maritime civilization that had relatively little farmland, plus 440,000 liters of premium pressed olive oil, used for everything from cooking to lamp fuel to cosmetics across the Mediterranean world. In exchange, Tyre would supply unlimited cedar and cypress timber, supplemental gold contributions, and most critically, a master craftsman named Hur-Am-Abi. Hur-Am-Abi is one of the most fascinating supporting characters in this entire story, and he gets almost no attention. His heritage was mixed: Israelite mother, Tyrian father, which meant he was fluent in both cultures, both aesthetic traditions, both technical schools. The text lists his competencies, and they're staggering: bronze, gold, silver, iron, stone, wood, purple and blue, and crimson fabric, fine linen. He could engrave, he could design, he could execute. He was essentially the chief architect, master engineer, and head of artistic production for the most ambitious building project in the ancient world. And then there was the logistics problem that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Getting the materials was only half the challenge. Moving them was the real engineering feat. Imagine standing at Joppa Harbor, modern-day Jaffa, just south of Tel Aviv, watching massive cedar logs arrive. Some individual logs weighed several tons. They'd been floated as rafts down the Mediterranean coast from the forests of Lebanon, 200 miles north. Now turn and look inland. Jerusalem sits 800 meters, nearly 2,600 feet above sea level, 60 kilometers of rocky, increasingly steep terrain between the port and the construction site. Every single log had to travel that road, on sledges, pulled by teams of men and animals, up switchbacks and mountain paths not designed for loads of that size and weight. No trucks, no trains, no cranes, just rope, timber rollers, and human determination. When you hold the finished temple in your mind, this gleaming, golden structure perched on a hilltop above Jerusalem, hold that image of a man on a mountain path, straining against a rope attached to a cedar log the size of a small building, and remember that the beauty and the suffering were inseparable from the very beginning. Now we need to talk about the 183,000. That number deserves its own moment of silence. 183,000 workers conscripted into a single building project. In a nation of perhaps 1 to 2 million people total, Solomon mobilized roughly 1 in every 10 citizens of Israel for this construction program. Scale that to the modern United States, and you're talking about 33 million people, all working on one structure. 1 Kings chapter 5 gives us the organizational breakdown, and what it reveals is deeply uncomfortable, especially given what this building was supposed to represent. At the top tier, 30,000 Israelites assigned to logging operations in Lebanon. These men worked in organized rotations, minus 10,000 at a time. 1 month cutting timber in the mountains, 2 months back home with their families. The work was brutal by any reasonable standard, but it was humane. They had rest. They saw their children grow. They had a life outside the project. Below them, 80,000 stonecutters and 70,000 carriers. The people doing the most exhausting, most dangerous, most physically destructive labor on the entire site. These 150,000 people were not Israelites. They were the descendants of Canaanite peoples that Israel had conquered in previous generations. Under the system Solomon inherited and expanded, they were subject to something the Hebrew text calls maz korvi labor, compulsory service to the state, with no rotation schedule and no release date. The text records this without editorial comment. It simply states the facts and moves on. But the moral weight of those facts is impossible to miss. This is the temple of the God who liberated Israel from slavery in Egypt, the God whose central act of self-revelation in the Hebrew Bible was breaking a slave nation free from the most powerful empire in the ancient world, the God whose law explicitly commanded Israel to remember what it felt like to be enslaved because you were slaves in Egypt. Appears over 30 times in Deuteronomy alone as the moral foundation for how Israel was to treat vulnerable people within its borders, and Solomon built that God's house substantially, with people who had no choice. That the man overseeing this forced labor operation was an official named Ad. He managed the logistics, the quotas, the discipline. It was not a position designed to make friends. Years later, when Solomon was dead and his son Rehoboam sat on the throne, the northern tribes sent representatives with one request: lighten the burden your father placed on us. When Rehoboam rejected that request, the tribes erupted in rebellion, and the man they found first was Adoniram. They stoned him in the street. There's also a young official mentioned briefly in connection with the labor program, a man named Jeroboam, assigned to supervise one of the work gangs. He watched the system operate from the inside. He saw the exhaustion and the resentment and the slow accumulation of injustice. After Solomon died, Jeroboam led the northern tribe secession from the Davidic monarchy. The rallying cry, preserved word for word in 1 Kings chapter 12, "Your father made our yoke heavy, lighten it." The temple's construction planted the seeds that would eventually split the kingdom in two. The most expensive building in history came with a price that couldn't be calculated in gold. But here's the mystery that changes how you see this entire project. If you had stood outside Jerusalem during any of those 7 years of active construction, 183,000 workers on site, millions of tons of stone being moved, the scaffolding rising, the most ambitious building project in the ancient world in full swing, what would you expect to hear? The rhythmic ring of hammers, the crack of chisels against stone, the grinding of iron tools, supervisors shouting across the noise, the ambient industrial roar of a construction site that covered acres. What visitors actually reported was something that stopped them in their tracks. Silence. Complete. Total silence. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. One of the strangest sentences in the entire Bible. No hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. 7 years, not a single tool sound on site. This was not an accident, and it was not coincidental. It was a deliberate theological mandate. And understanding why requires understanding how ancient Israelites thought about iron. Iron was the metal of weapons. Swords were iron, spear tips were iron. The tools of war and killing were iron, and war meant bloodshed, and blood was the one thing that could never touch the dwelling place of the God of peace. The principle had been established centuries earlier. Exodus chapter 20 had already prohibited the use of iron tools on altar stones. Deuteronomy chapter 27 reinforced it. Solomon didn't create this rule, he expanded it. If the altar stone was too sacred for iron, then every wall, every floor, every threshold, every surface of the entire temple complex was equally sacred. The house of peace would be built by peaceful means. From beginning to completion, the silence wasn't just a construction requirement. It was an act of worship built into the process itself, a 7-year expression of the purpose of the building. But the question that follows immediately is the obvious one. How do you build a massive, architecturally complex stone structure without tools on site? The answer is a technique that modern architects now call full-scale prefabrication, and Solomon's engineers executed it at a level of precision that still draws admiration from structural engineers today. The system worked like this. Every single stone to be used in the temple was quarried miles from Jerusalem. At the source, quarry teams would cut a stone to its final specifications, measured, shaped, smoothed, finished completely, and only then transported to the construction site. When a stone arrived at Jerusalem, it went directly into position. No trimming, no adjustment, no refinement, no iron tools required, because none were needed. The work was already done. Imagine the organizational demands this created. You have quarry teams operating at multiple sites, potentially miles apart, all working from the same detailed specifications. Every team has to understand precisely which stone they're cutting, what its exact dimensions need to be, what position it will occupy in the final structure, how it will interface with the stones above and below and beside it. There are no computers. There are no laser measuring tools. There are no digital blueprints transmitted to a screen on the quarry floor. There are hand measurements, physical templates, and the accumulated skill of craftsmen who could not afford to make mistakes, because there was no correction possible on site. One block, cut a centimeter too wide, the entire section fails. They didn't fail. The primary source for the temple stone was directly beneath Jerusalem itself, a vast underground quarry, now known as Zedekiah's Cave, or Solomon's Quarries, extending 5 acres of carved tunnels, 200 meters into the bedrock beneath the city. You can visit these tunnels today. The air inside is cool and still year-round. The silence is total and somewhat overwhelming, the same silence that filled these passages 3,000 years ago when 80,000 men worked here by torchlight. Run your hand along the tunnel walls, and you can still feel the chiseled marks, individual tool strokes, preserved in stone for 3 millennia, each mark made by a man whose name we'll never know, cutting a stone he would never see placed, working from a plan he could only partially understand, trusting that somewhere far above him, at a construction site he might never visit, his work would eventually find its purpose. The stone they extracted there is called melech, from the Hebrew word for king, often translated as royal stone. It has a property that made it nearly ideal for this application. Underground, it's relatively soft and workable. Exposed to air, It gradually hardens over months and years until it achieves a near marble density and durability, perfect for precision, shaping before transport, better than granite, which is hard to work, better than limestone, which is often too soft. Meloke hit the ideal middle point, carvable underground, durable above ground. 80,000 men spent years in these tunnels, in darkness broken only by the orange flicker of oil lamps, cutting stones by feel and template and accumulated skill, and every mark they made was an act of faith in a plan they couldn't fully see. That, too, was worship. 7 years, then it was done. 1 Kings chapter 6 gives us the completed dimensions: 60 cubits long, roughly 90 feet, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits tall, a structure roughly the footprint of a modest office building, but designed as the dwelling place of the creator of the universe. But the dimensions don't communicate what the building actually looked like. The materials do. Step through the massive bronze doors. The floor beneath your feet is cedar, overlaid with gold. The walls on every side are cedar, overlaid with gold. The ceiling above you is cedar, overlaid with gold. The text is explicit. Not a single stone surface was visible anywhere inside. Every exposed surface was covered first in carved cedar floral patterns, cherubim, palm trees, open flowers, and then overlaid in gold. Not painted to look like gold, not coated with a thin wash, overlaid thick sheets of hammered gold applied directly to the carved cedar, conforming to every contour of every carved detail. Move toward the back of the main hall, and the atmosphere shifts. The air changes, the light changes. You're approaching the Holy of Holies, the innermost room, the innermost sanctuary, the room that held the most sacred object in all of Israel. The room is a perfect cube, 20 cubits in every direction, about 30 feet. The walls and floor and ceiling are gold. Inside this cube, 2 carved cherubim stand 15 feet tall, wings extended, their combined wingspan spanning the entire 30-foot width of the room, tip to tip. And beneath those wings, on a stone platform, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest containing the tablets of the law given to Moses at Sinai, the physical object that represented, in Israelite theology, the footstool of the throne of God. This was the center of everything. Every stone cut in underground darkness, every log floated down the coast, every laborer who spent years under the sun hauling stone up Jerusalem's hills, all of it was ultimately in service of this moment. This room, this box, the furnishings of the outer courts were no less extraordinary. 2 massive bronze pillars flanked the entrance to the main hall, each 27 feet tall with ornate capitals, and given names. Yakin, he establishes. Boaz, in him is strength. A massive bronze basin called the sea sat in the outer court, supported on the backs of 12 bronze bulls, 3 facing each direction of the compass, capable of holding 12,000 gallons of water used for ritual cleansing, 10 golden lampstands, 10 golden tables, a golden altar, golden bowls, golden dishes, golden sprinkling basins, golden wick trimmers. The text lists them without commentary, the way you might list items on a packing manifest. Gold, 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 gold. The total quantity of gold used in the temple interior was staggering even by the standards of David's original treasury. Gold wasn't merely decorative here, it was communicative. It was saying, in the visual language of the ancient Near East, that this building was in a different category from every other structure on earth. The dedication ceremony arrived. All Israel gathered, every tribe, elders and leaders and common people, assembled on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Solomon stood before the massive bronze altar in the outer court. The priests lifted the Ark of the Covenant, carried on golden poles, as the law specified, and processed through the courtyard, through the great bronze doors, through the gold-plated main hall, into the perfect golden cube of the Holy of Holies. They set it down beneath the wings of the cherubim. They withdrew, and then something happened that no one present had been expecting at quite that scale. 2 Chronicles chapter 5. Then the temple of the Lord was filled with a cloud, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the temple of God, the visible, tangible, overwhelming presence of God, not incense smoke, not morning fog rolling in from the valley. The glory, the same cloud that had led Israel through the wilderness for 40 years. The same fire and cloud that had descended on the tabernacle when Moses consecrated it, now descended on this building. So thick, the priests couldn't stand. These were not ordinary men. These were the sons of Aaron, trained from birth for this specific function, carrying out the most sacred religious duties of their civilization. They had walked into the Holy of Holies. They had touched the ark. They had performed every ritual, exactly as prescribed, and they couldn't stand. They fell to their knees. Some fell on their faces. The dedication service they had prepared to conduct was suspended, not by human decision, but because the presence in the room made it physically impossible to proceed. Think about what that moment meant for every person connected to this project, for the 8 men who had cut stone in underground darkness for years, never knowing if their work would ever matter, for the 70,000 carriers who had hauled stone up Jerusalem's hills under the sun, day after day, month after month, for the 30,000 Israelite loggers who had spent months away from their families in the mountains of Lebanon, for David, who had died before seeing a single wall rise, whose life's work was this moment. The silence of 7 years of construction gave way to the thunder of divine presence. Every sacrifice validated, every drop of sweat accounted for, every talent of gold justified. God moved in Solomon, on his knees in front of the altar, prayed one of the most remarkable prayers in the Bible, recorded in 1 Kings chapter 8. And the most extraordinary moment in that prayer is not the praise or the petition, it's the question he asks in the middle of it. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? He already knew the answer was no. He understood, with unusual theological clarity, that no building could contain the God he was dedicating the building to. The infinite can't be housed in the finite. The creator of the cosmos doesn't need 90 feet of cedar and gold to have a place to sleep. He built it anyway, because the building was never about containing God. It was about giving people specific, finite, historically located, struggling, doubting, hoping people a place to come and look for him. But the story has an ending that most people either skip past or don't know. The financial reality of what Solomon built hit his kingdom hard. The debt accumulated over 20 years of payments to Hiram of Tyre, combined with the extraordinary costs of construction, had drained resources faster than even David's enormous treasury could absorb. When the final accounting came due, Solomon was short, so he paid Hiram in land, 20 cities in the region of Galilee, real estate, productive territory, communities with populations handed over to a foreign king as debt payment. Hiram personally traveled to inspect his new holdings. He called them Kabul. The Hebrew word means worthless, or as good as nothing. Whether he meant the land was literally poor quality, or whether he was expressing offense at being paid in shrublan for 20 years of premium cedar and gold. The diplomatic damage was real. The relationship between Israel and Tyre cooled noticeably after that transaction, and then there was the internal debt, the human cost that couldn't be paid in gold or land. The 150,000 Canaanite workers who had spent years under forced labor, conscription, the people whose endless labor had made the whole project possible, had families, communities, memories, grievances that passed from parent to child, accumulating with interest across the years. The 30,000 Israelite loggers who had worked the rotation system in Lebanon, they were free men, technically, but they had spent months away from their farms and families for years of their lives. They had felt the weight of the conscription system too, even if their experience was incomparably better than the Canaanites. And there was Jeroboam, who had watched it all from the inside. When Solomon died and his son Rehoboam took the throne, Jeroboam organized the northern tribes' petition. Their demand was simple. Their framing was honest. Your father's projects and your father's administration made our lives unbearable. We're asking you, at the start of your reign, to do things differently. Rehoboam consulted his council of senior advisors. They told him to grant the request. Then he consulted his young friends, the men he'd grown up with, who had never administered anything more complex than their own estates. They told him to increase the burden. Rehoboam announced his decision publicly. My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. The northern tribes left permanently the United Kingdom of Israel, the empire David had spent his life building and Solomon had inherited at its peak, split into two smaller kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and they never reunified. The temple that was supposed to be the crown jewel of a unified people became instead the symbol of the southern kingdom alone. It stood for 373 years, through Rehoboam and Abijah, through Asa and Jehoshaphat, and the long succession of kings, some faithful and some corrupt, through reforms and revivals and apostasies and returns, through sieges and near misses and diplomatic crises and prophetic confrontations. For 373 years, the morning light hit those gold-plated walls and made them blaze. Then, in 587 BC, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar marched into Jerusalem after a prolonged siege. They breached the walls, they burned the city, they carried the population into exile, and they burned the temple. The gold was stripped first, sent back to Babylon as war prize and imperial tribute. Then the cedar beams caught, and the fire spread, and the building that had taken 7 years to construct and cost approximately $590 billion in materials was gone in hours. The Ark of the Covenant disappears from the historical record at this point. No one knows with certainty what happened to it. It simply isn't mentioned again after the Babylonian conquest. What stood for 373 years was reduced to a scorched foundation in a single afternoon. $490 billion, 183,000 workers, 7 years of silence, 373 years of standing, one afternoon of Ashdod, and yet here we are, 3,000 years later, still talking about it. That's the part worth sitting with. Not the gold is gone. Not the cedar burned. Not the ark, its location is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Not even the building itself, which hasn't existed for 2,600 years. What remained is the question Solomon asked on his knees on dedication day, the question he already knew the answer to. Will God really dwell on earth? The heavens cannot contain him. How much less this temple I have built? He built it anyway. He spent 7 years, $500 billion in materials, 183,000 lives worth of labor, and the long-term political stability of his own kingdom. Building something he fully understood was inadequate to its stated purpose. No building can contain the infinite. No structure can house the creator of space. He built it because the alternative, building nothing, offering nothing, attempting nothing, was worse. There's something in that worth sitting with for a long time, because you're building something too, maybe. It's a career that keeps demanding more than you expected to give. Maybe it's a marriage that has cost more than the version you imagined when you started. Maybe it's a faith you're trying to maintain in circumstances that make faith difficult. Maybe it's a family, or a business, or a creative work, or a legacy you're not even sure anyone will notice. Most of what you're cutting, you'll never see placed. Most of what you're carrying, you won't live to see completed. And there will be moments, there have probably already been moments, where you ask Solomon's question out loud, in the dark, when nobody is listening. Is this even worth it? Is what I'm building actually going to matter? Is anyone going to show up when it's done? Solomon didn't have a guaranteed answer when he started. He had a dying father's blueprint, a promissory note, and a God who had told the previous king he would do this but hadn't said exactly how it would turn out. He'd cut the stones in the dark. Anyway, he assembled them in silence. Anyway, he dedicated the building without knowing for certain what would happen at the end, and the presence showed up. The question isn't whether what you're building is perfect. Solomon's temple came with debt and forced labor and political consequences that split a kingdom. The question isn't whether the cost is higher than you expected. It will be. It always is. The question is the same one it's always been. Do you trust the plan enough to keep cutting in the dark? There are two ways to read Solomon's story, as a triumph or as a tragedy. I think the most honest answer is that it's both, simultaneously, which is exactly why it's still being told 3,000 years later. Which lens do you see it through? And what are you building right now that you're not sure is worth the cost? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.